It's my pleasure to introduce three very important journalists in very different fields. Samantha Barry is the editor-in-chief of Glamour magazine. She's been a guest lecturer at Yale and a Sulzberger Fellow at Columbia. And really interestingly, she was the executive producer for social and emerging media at CNN prior to coming to Glamour. She also told me today that ABC put her in Papua New Guinea for 2 years, and I'm thinking, gosh, ABC had a bureau in Papua New Guinea, and I looked at the fine print, and it was the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. So, Samantha, welcome. You are from where in Ireland?
Cork. Haven't been home in a while, though, so fingers crossed this summer.
Noah Oppenheim is known to many of you. He's the president of NBC News, where he's responsible for just about everything that's going on in the world of news, both at home and in terms of running bureaus across the world. But if you didn't read his bio in full, note that he's also a screenwriter who wrote the film Jackie and co-wrote Maze Runner. And why are you still doing what you're doing? That sounds like a lot more fun.
Great question. Yeah.
Okay, and Jeff Goldberg, nobody needs to be introduced to.
That's not fair.
But I will say...
Say something nice, come on.
I will say, Jeff, that, somebody had the very good sense to make you editor of the year and also give you awards for your national magazine reporting. And as you know, Jeff has brought some of the most remarkable interviews to our stage over the last many years that we've been working together. And if it rains again, will you do that Moses quote again? Okay, all right, okay. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the future of media. Part of it's gonna do with issues of trust, but I wanna start out by talking about the business model, which is changing sort of quite dramatically. We're going to drill down into that topic. Samantha, I want to just ask you and start with this. Glamour is a long-standing, highly regarded publication by Condé Nast, if you're not familiar with where it sits in the world of publications, historically focused on fashion, beauty, and very ad-driven.
Very ad-driven. So,
but your world and your publication are changing, and you shared some things today about your revenue model, which shocked me. I just wonder if you could chat about that a little bit.
Of course. So for those of you that aren't, not all of you are Glamour readers, I can see looking out, but it's been around since 1939, right? It's one of the original women's titles. Its first tagline was for Glamour of Hollywood, but in the 40s, when the world went to war and women flooded the workplace, it changed its tagline pretty quickly for the girl with the job. And yes, it covered fashion and beauty, but definitely lifestyle and wellness and health. It was the first place to ever pay Andy Warhol for his art. He used to sketch for Glamour. It was the first magazine in America to put a black woman on the cover, which was so ahead of its day. And it had all these great moments in the world of magazines. And in the world of publishing, it did really, really well. And if you look back deep into the archives, it was a very clear-cut model, right? The editor-in-chief was responsible for the cover and the pages of content. And the publisher was responsible for surrounding that with very expensive print ads. And that was it, right? Black and white, very easy, printing money for publishing. Great. That, I was an unexpected choice, I think, for Condé. I'd spent my whole career in broadcast and digital and storytelling. But what they needed was somebody to come into Glamour and take the title into a different way of storytelling and look at it, not only the content across different platforms, but the potential revenues. So within the first year, I stopped print, which was, some people were sentimental about it, but I wanted to focus our energy into video and social and digital and places that I knew that we could win in content, but also revenue. So what is different now about our model is that we make content for lots of different platforms, right? For owned and operated, for YouTube, for video, for social. We've also launched Glamour Studios, so we've started doing development for big movie and documentary projects. And our revenue stream is, yes, there's digital advertising, yes, there's sponsored and branded content, but there's a massively growing commerce business that we've built under the Glamour title. We have lots more different revenue streams coming from community and subscription events. And I think as an editor today, what you're looking at is how am I bringing content that serves all of those different places that we play in order to make the most money in order to put it back into the content, because I feel like that's what all of us on this stage are really invested in, is how do we continue to make money so we can continue to tell stories. And I think in the 90s and before that, and even the early 2000s at Glamour, it was very black and white. Now you've got to be a bit more innovative in where you play and how you make money in media.
Noah, you've been in a ratings battle. I was looking at sort of weekly ratings in the news media, and it's up and down, and it's a constant battle, and it seems to be reported a lot. I guess it has a lot to do with advertisers. Obviously, cable's in there. You're diversifying and targeting your markets, but in this sort of always-on digital soundbite media consumption, what wins the day for NBC News, NBC Nightly News, NBC and its affiliates? What drives your success?
Well, I think what drives our success is when we can offer people something that they don't already know. I mean, we live in a world where sort of basic news and information is somewhat commodified, and by the time you get to 6:30 at night when Lester Holt comes on, you probably, if you're interested in the world, have a vague understanding of what's happened during the day. And so it's imperative each and every night that we offer people some new angle on the news of the day, some kind of analysis that they hadn't thought of before. We platform a voice they hadn't heard before. It's about giving the audience that additional value and insight into the world around them. For us, it's also about clinging, frankly, to the increasingly besieged model of traditional, objective, middle-of-the-road journalism. It's very easy to attract eyeballs if you're in the business of reinforcing people's pre-existing biases and making them feel good about the things they already believe. It's a lot harder to attract eyeballs when sometimes you're challenging those preconceptions and biases. We believe deeply in that mission. We believe it's critical to the health of our democracy and of our society. And so what we're trying to do is say, we're a legacy media company in the best sense of that word. We are omni-channel in the way that Sam was describing. We're trying to meet consumers on all the platforms where they seek news, but we're very old-fashioned and proudly legacy when it comes to upholding the traditional standards of journalism and trying to speak to the broadest possible audience, ideologically speaking.
That's interesting. Okay, so Jeff, one thing that's really surprised me about your revenue model is that it's shifted so significantly to subscriptions. Right. And can you just talk a little bit about that? I mean, it used to be ad-driven, and I don't know if you all know, but Jeff and his team have driven Atlantic subscriptions over 800,000, but with millions more coming to your website digitally. How did you do that, and how is that elevating both the quality of your journalism, but also is it paying for everything?
Is it paying for everything?
Yes.
Not in a technical sense, but spiritually, it's been very rewarding. It'll pay for everything eventually. I mean, you got to invest to, there's a CEO sitting right there. I'm not going to talk about how we make money. Anyway, it's not my main concern. We do still have separation of church and state in an institution like the Atlantic, and I try not to think about, I'm not supposed to think about the money. I'm supposed to think about the quality of journalism. To answer your direct question, we shifted toward subscriptions. I mean, we haven't abandoned advertising. Obviously, we'll take it, obviously, and we go out and seek it. But we did it because we had to do it. It's an unstable market. It's probably in secular decline of some sort. Facebook and Google eat up 90% of all digital advertising now and would eat up 100% if they could. And so the reality of the world is such that we had to do that. But the advantage is of having a circulation-dependent model is that we're in a direct relationship with our readers. I'm not insulting anyone. I think when I say that all things being equal, I would rather be trying to please our readers, subscribers, with the quality of journalism than trying to figure out what advertisers want from our magazine. right? I'm going to be dependent on advertising for many years to come, partially dependent. But I think what we've done is ultimately healthy for the journalism, and obviously it's a kind of way of spreading out risk. You know, we always get. You know, we run a lot of controversial material. The country's polarized. Nobody likes everything that we publish. Constantly getting people threatening me to cancel their subscriptions. And my rule is, if 50,000 people write in on a morning and say that they're canceling the subscriptions, I'll pay attention. But that's just. But I don't have to pay attention to that. I shouldn't pay attention to that in some ways because we don't want to be pressured by interest groups that are forming nodes in the readership. But I shouldn't pay attention to it because the risk is so spread out now. Where a typical magazine can be dependent on 10 to 25 big advertisers. We're approaching 800,000 subscribers. That's more than we've had in 164 years.
800,000.
Yeah, it's approaching is probably more accurate in the technical sense of being correct. From a mathematics standpoint, I think it's a much better place to be, and we're not doing cheapo subscribe. I mean, our typical subscription acquisition is $50 a year, so it's not nothing. We have more readers coming than ever. The pandemic was kind of insane in terms of traffic. It's relaxed a little bit since then, but we're doing 30 to 40 million unique visitors a month. Every unique visitor is an opportunity to convert that person into a subscriber. And the way we do it, and this is I'll end on this because this is the most important point. The way we do it, and thank God for this, because otherwise I would leave, is by providing quality journalism. It turns out that there's a portion of the American public and international public that still wants quality journalism, deeply reported, carefully edited, fact-checked. Like it to be more, obviously, but it's been a it's salvation from a business standpoint, but it also is very heartening because it means that the crap commodification that goes on across the internet is not the only story.
Right. So, I think that's incredibly valuable, and it speaks to the sort of integrity that you bring to your publication. Noah, you have a different dilemma, I would think, in that you've been a national brand. NBC News has been around since the beginning of television, and you speak to millions every single day. And now everybody's consuming their news in their own way, and they're curating their own news feeds. And especially as we all need to cultivate younger audiences. How do you think about audience cultivation in the future when you wake up to your Twitter feed, which might have a blurb from NBC or your competitor, or you look at Facebook and it's got, somebody telling you a story that they thought they heard on the Washington Post, and then how do you target new audiences with all that you have to accomplish?
Sure. Well, I think there's two ways we do it. We think about it both in terms of the platform that we're reaching the audience on, and we think about how do we tell the story in a way that's going to most resonate with that particular consumer. So, for instance, we were one of the first news brands to have a show on Snapchat. We do a show called Stay Tuned on Snapchat. The average age of the person consuming NBC News via that show is in their teens and tweens. Those people, I can assure you, are not watching Meet the Press or the Evening News. But we're reaching them there, and we're doing it via particularly visual and fast-paced style of storytelling, but it's still grounded, again, in those same traditional principles that Jeff was referencing of just fact-checked, reliable, objective, edited journalism. We have two streaming platforms, NBC News Now and Today All Day, for people who don't watch television or don't have cable subscriptions, but want the news and information that we provide. And the sensibility that you will find on each of those platforms is slightly different. The kind of people presenting the news on those platforms is slightly different, but again, at the core of it are still those old-fashioned journalistic principles. So we try to be everywhere where people of various ages and backgrounds are looking for news and information, and we try to reach them via storytelling, means that are going to most connect with them.
That makes a lot of sense. Sam, I want to ask you a more specific question that's pertinent to your own audience, which is women. largely women. I learned today that 20% of Glamour's audience is actually men, but given that the concept of beauty is changing, especially among younger people, how do we define beauty now, and how do we talk about it, and how do we show it? Sort of, how do you reach different audiences? Sam shared with me that 60% of American women are now plus 14. That is not the image that we have of somebody who's on the cover of Glamour or Vogue or Self or Shape or anything else, for example. And yet plus-sized women are only 2% seen in the media. And how do you address that? How do you reconcile this concept of beauty and health and wellness with a population that's larger than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, physically larger?
I think we've moved away, at least I know at Glamour, we've moved away from this super aspirational version of beauty or style. And what we're seeing from our audience is they want to see themselves represented, right? So 60% of women in America are over a size 12, I think. And they're only representative in 2% of the media that we see. And that's everybody from a contributor on NBC to who they see in movies, who they see in posters, what they see in Times Square. Like, that is a massive disparity. And in a lot of, what we have done at Glamour is be like, we need to include women in everything we see. So I remember walking in the door, not coming from a fashion background, and meeting a lot of the designers in my first couple of months, and I made them a promise. I was like, if you extend your sizes, I will give you coverage, because I know what size the Glamour reader is, and you're not making clothes for her. And so I made a blanket promise, and I think ended up having about 20 fashion houses or designers come back to us and making good on that promise, because they came back and extended their sizes and wanted coverage. But it's really about, I think, a lot of, especially when you're talking about young millennials and Gen Zs, they want to see themselves represented. We did, one of our biggest pieces last year was on hair discrimination in the US. And on the Crown Act, and we did an amazing cover. And in that, we had to do a mea culpa, because I went into the archives and I saw some of the things that Glamour had written in the 90s and the early 2000s about natural hair and how to style your hair, and it was not okay. It was definitely not woke. It was just diving into being an advocate for making sure women across the world of America aren't discriminated against for whatever their natural beauty is. We had to say, hold our hands up, and we're like, we made a mistake in the past. But I think here's the interesting thing, because these guys talked about content reaching people. What I'm seeing as well with their audience is even the things they share, they want the values of the media companies that they share to be aligned with how they identify themselves. And if that is inclusive and accessible, that's the type of content that they want to share across the world of beauty or style or all of those places, or NBC News. I think it's interesting to watch digital habits with people, how what they share is really, I think, much more of an extension of who they see themselves as.
So interesting. All right, we don't have that much more time, so I do want to get into the question of trust. And this is a big issue, as you all know, and we've seen over the last several years these references to fake news and enemy of the people, and a massive shift in trust, not only with the media, but with government is an all-time low in terms of trust. The Edelman Trust Barometer measures trust across a lot of sectors. And Chip, I didn't get a chance to ask you a question, but the trust in business is at an all-time high. And trusted CEOs, and interestingly, trust in the media that an employer gives to their employees is more trusted than say, other media, so newsletters and so forth that comes within a company to each of us is more trusted than a lot of what people see out in the marketplace. And I found that very interesting. So the statistics suggest that news organizations are seen as biased to a degree not seen maybe ever. 59% of respondents feel journalists and reporters are purposely trying to mislead by serving up gross exaggeration or false information. And 59% of the respondents to the survey also believe that most news organizations are more concerned with supporting an ideology or political position than informing the public. And yet, subscriptions are up for The Atlantic, for the New York Times, for The Economist. I mean, people are paying for media, I would think, more than they ever have. And certainly, now you have Peacock, and I realize that might be more entertainment driven, but people are now paying for media, which is a little bit, if you so don't really trust it, why are you buying it? I think that's an interesting question. So Jeff, this seems like a disconnect. Obviously people trust you or they wouldn't subscribe. So you talk about quality media. You also said to us earlier today that when we met, that your goal is not to be popular, that the role of journalists isn't to be popular. That's not what you're here for. So can you talk a little bit about sort of this subscriptions going up, lack of trust in the media in general, you're not supposed to be popular. How do I put that all together?
A couple of points. I'll try to go in some sort of linear way. Yeah, to that point, of course we're not supposed to be popular. We're supposed to present the truth, however we come to the truth. And if people like it, fine. If they don't like it, also fine. We're supposed to present a diversity of opinions. I mean, not everyone is supposed to. There are some magazines, newspapers that are frankly ideological, television networks too, and they're not trying to promote a diversity of opinion or thought. They're trying to get one message across. That's okay. That's their model. But popularity isn't. Respect would be a good metric rather than popularity, I think. One point that's worth making. We talk about, and this is not exactly a representative audience, is 340 million people in America, right? If you add up all the people who pay for subscriptions to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Economist, you're talking about 12, 13 million people, right? I mean, disproportionately influential people, obviously, but it's, that's one slice. I also, just to sort of answer a couple of the other points that you raised, and I'm sure my colleagues have other points to add to this, but, this issue of trust, it's not the weather. It's not, to borrow an earlier talk, it's not just happens something naturally. It's not the weather. This is not a natural phenomenon. There have been large and important organizations in America that have been poisoning the minds of Americans about the media very deliberately. I'm thinking about Fox News in particular. Deliberately poisoning people, deliberately poisoning the idea of trust, deliberately poisoning the idea that that people in the media are flawed, and obviously we could talk all day about all the mistakes we've all made, all the mistakes our organizations have made, but there is a deliberate attempt to subvert the idea that there is such a thing as empirical truth, observable truth, and there are people who are trying to undermine the idea that most people in journalism are trying in good faith to try to get at something resembling the truth. So you can't do this for year after year after year after year and add in the social media maelstrom to all of this. And so we're fighting, and Chuck Todd, one of Noah's employees, has said this. He's written this for The Atlantic, because NBC people do a lot of their best work for The Atlantic. He wrote a piece for us saying that, we as an industry, we don't, quote unquote, lobby for ourselves. We just assume that saying we're putting out trustworthy information is enough. And he said, we have sort of left the field bare, and basically allowed people with, I think, nefarious agendas to come in and poison the minds of we've talked a lot on this stage. We've talked a lot in the last 5 years, and I'll end with this point about how do you reach that 35 or 40% of Americans who have decided to embrace an alternative truth system or alternative reality system. And the answer, I used to try to fake my way through an answer because I'd like to think that there's an answer to this question. I'm not sure there necessarily is. I'm not sure that any one organization can figure that out. I think we're in an incredibly dangerous moment when you have 30 or 40%, at least, of the country that is completely impervious to what we would think of as enlightenment values of empirical truth, of using observation and rationality and reason to deduce what is real and what is not. So these are much larger problems. And so what you're seeing there, in surveys is the end product, the end result of a very, very, very long process, often deliberate, to make people not believe that the thing that they're seeing is actually real.
So Noah, just to move this along, because this is really, really, really important, what can the media do to unify us? Does the media have a role as unifier in some way?
I don't think it's our job to unify. That's not our job. Our job is to, hold the powerful accountable, to try to capture the best available version of the truth at any given time, and convey it as broadly as possible. I want to say I agree with almost everything Jeffrey said there. I agree we're in a terribly dangerous moment. I agree that there's unequivocally bad actors out there who are throwing gasoline on the fire and trying to drive wedges between Americans and trying to attack the notion of an empirical truth. But that said, there were fires burning before that gasoline got thrown on, and I think that as an industry, one of the things, in addition to what Chuck points out that we don't do well, is we have to acknowledge our role in this. Whenever trust breaks down in a relationship, each party played a role in that. And I think that if you look at the way that newsrooms have been constituted in the last several decades and the groups of people who are making decisions about what stories get told and what angle gets brought to those stories, it has not reflected the reality of a lot of Americans. And I think we're seeing a reckoning across the board as newsrooms try to rectify that. I think that, if you read the New York Times, if you watched, frankly, NBC, if you read The Atlantic over the last few years during the course of the Trump administration, there would have been periods of time where you would have thought that we were collectively, as mainstream media, telling you that on any given day you were going to wake up and see Donald Trump hauled off in handcuffs and accused of being a KGB agent. And that did not happen. And so a lot of people looked at that coverage and say, well, wait a second, are these people telling us the truth? Our polling has been wrong, really wrong, 2 election cycles in a row. We have a responsibility to look at ourselves and say, why was it wrong and how do we fix it? And I think that the more transparent we are about the imperfect nature of what we do, as Jeffrey said, we're flawed. It is like scientific inquiry, journalistic inquiry gets it wrong sometimes, and we have to do a better job of explaining that to people, and then we have to do a better job of fixing it when we make mistakes, and I think that's how we sort of gradually rebuild trust over time.
And I also think on what we talked a little bit about earlier, it's like how newsrooms are built, right? Like I worked for BBC World News in London, came over to work at CNN, and it was this amazing, phenomenal, like during the 2016 election, that when there was a debate or a convention, it felt like all of New York media descended upon Flint, Michigan, or it descended upon Dallas, or it descended and ran around trying to tell local stories. And I think we were chatting earlier about the fact that newsrooms and media organizations have to be set up where there are people in those places telling those stories from all different types of diversity, including, I think, one of the worst cases of inequality in American newsrooms is socioeconomic diversity. Because to Jeff's point, nobody goes into journalism for the money, and so there's a lot of quite wealthy kids that come in at low-paid journalism jobs, and they work their way up, and you're not seeing kind of that pipeline of different socioeconomic groups getting into newsrooms in America.
Mm-hmm. And then COVID has offered an opportunity. I mean, because remote work has become more widely accepted, we're going out, we're hiring reporters in communities around the country and saying to them, we're picking up a lot of this great talent that's been left behind by the collapse of local journalism, and rather than move them to New York, LA, or Washington, we're saying, stay in the communities that you live in and report on the reality around you from there.
I mean, just to add on to that, this is probably the most important and positive development for media is this diversification. I mean, between probably like half the journalists who work for us live within the same 4 neighborhoods in Brooklyn right now, and that's not healthy. Mm-hmm. That is just not it, because they reinforce everything that the other one thinks, and so we absolutely do have that problem, and we're fixing it. The pandemic has, unfortunately, we needed a pandemic to help us start fixing it, but it's fixing.
Which begins to answer Gwen Eifel's question that she asked in our video, which is, how do we see each other? Perhaps we see each other better if we're actually in each other's communities, as opposed to ivory towers in select cities and newsrooms that aren't that connected to people across the country, no matter what political spectrum they're in. Thank you all very, very much for coming. I really appreciate it.